Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the keynote address of the 16th Annual Convention of the Media Ecology Association. My name is Jim Morrison, and I'm here to introduce our keynote speaker, Nicholas Carr. Nicholas Carr is, to my mind, the most stimulating and provocative writer about technology and culture in America today. He's the author of the acclaimed new book, The Glass Cage, Automation and Us, which examines the personal and social consequences of our ever-growing dependency on computers. His previous work, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, was a 2011 Pulitzer Prize finalist and a New York Times bestseller. Earlier today, in my presentation on these two books, I expressed the opinion that in The Shallows, Nicholas Carr did for the Internet what Neil Postman did for television, and that The Glass Cage constitutes today's very worthy successor to Postman's Technopoly. I hope that after you hear him speak, you want to go out and get these books and read them, if you haven't already, and decide whether I'm right or not. Nicholas Carr is also the author of two other influential books, The Big Switch, Rewiring the World from Edison to Google, that was 2008, which the Financial Times calls the best read so far about the significance of the shift to cloud computing, and Does IT Matter, in 2004. His books have been translated into more than 25 languages. He has also written for The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, Wired, Nature, MIT Technology Review, and many other periodicals. His essays, including Is Google Making Us Stupid? And The Great Forgetting, have been collected in several anthologies, including The Best American Science and Nature Writing, The Best Spiritual Writing, and The Best Technology Writing. He also writes the popular blog Rough Type. He's a former member of the Encyclopedia Britannica's editorial board of advisors, was on the steering board of the World Economic Forum's Cloud Computing Project, and was a writer in residence at the University of California at Berkeley's Journalism School. Earlier in his career, he was executive editor of the Harvard Business Review. He holds an A.B. degree from Dartmouth College and an M.A. in English and American Literature and Language from Harvard University. And you may also be interested to know that in the early 1980s, he was a founding member of the Connecticut punk band, the Adrenaline Boys. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Nicholas Carr.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. And it's a great pleasure, great honor to be able to speak to you this afternoon and share some of my thoughts, and an even deeper pleasure and honor to be the recipient of this year's Neil Postman Award. That's also a humbling honor. Whenever I read anything by Neil Postman, I'm reminded that pretty much everything I've said in the last 10 years or so, he said earlier and often more wittily than I've managed. When I was putting together my remarks for today, I had occasion to flip through Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, the 20th anniversary edition, the one with the people who have televisions as heads. And I was struck by, at the very beginning of the book, one of the blurbs from reviewers, one of the blurbs of praise for the book, comes from a reviewer at the Christian Science Monitor who wrote, Postman starts where Marshall McLuhan left off, constructing his arguments with the resources of a scholar and the wit of a raconteur. Now, I can't claim to either the resources of a scholar or the wit of a raconteur, but I can follow Postman's lead in beginning where Marshall McLuhan left off, in fact, literally where he left off, at least in Understanding Media, with the very last sentence of that book. And what McLuhan wrote at the end is this: panic about automation as a threat of uniformity on a world scale is the projection into the future of mechanical standardization and specialism, which are now past. That's not one of McLuhan's greatest sentences, I have to say. But there are two things in that sentence that I'd like to particularly point to. One of them is McLuhan's sense of automation as a liberating force as we move from the machine age, the mechanical age, which he saw as a mechanism for kind of narrow specialization and constraining human thought and creativity, to the world to the electronic age of computers and digitization and automation in particular. He thought we'd be returned to a much broader scope of activity and thought. And I think he's pretty much dead wrong about that, but I'll get to that later. The other point I want to make is just to stress the way he included automation in the scope of media. In one sense, that reflects McLuhan's very broad definition of media, but I also think it's an important insight that he had. And he refers to panic about automation. Today, when we read that, because we are now in the midst of a panic about automation, a lot of things being written about how all jobs are going to be taken over by robots, and then there'll be the singularity, and we'll be destroyed by our own creations and so forth. It makes what McLuhan said seem very prophetic, but in fact he was very much writing from the viewpoint of his own time, because compared to what's going on today, the panic about automation was actually much, much stronger in 1964. In fact, it had been going on for 10 or 15 years, beginning probably with the publication in 1950 of Norbert Wiener's book, The Human Use of Human Beings, which raised the specter of massive job loss and also the kind of loss of our humanity. So that was a very contemporary reference that McLuhan was making, very much inspired by the discussions going on in popular culture around him. But again, to me, what's of main interest is this thought that automation is itself a form of media. And I think he's right about that, and that's what I'd like to talk about this afternoon, is first of all, what are we to make of automation when we think of it as an element of media, and also what kind of media environment then is automation creating for us. And I'll start with an argument for why it's useful to think about automation, the use of computers and software to take over work or thoughts or other jobs that we used to do ourselves, why it's useful to think of it as media. And I'll give you a brief history of media, and I emphasize that this is a brief history of media that suits my own purposes right now, and you can have your own histories of media, as I'm sure you do. And I'll look at it through the lens of my personal favorite medium of all time, which is the map. The map may well be the original, the first human medium, and as you trace its evolution through time, you see encapsulated in it, I think, changes in media in general. So when you think about the original map, how it came about, and I wasn't there, but I would guess that a person who had knowledge of an area, of a location, of a place, used a map as a simple tool, simple media tool, to express that knowledge in visual terms to a person who wanted to make his or her way through that space. So you had the knower who knew the place, and you had the doer who wanted to get through the space, go from point A to point B, and the knower probably sketched out on the ground or in a stone or something a quick map saying, you know, you go past the big tree and over the river, and then you'll get to where you want to go. So media as a very simple tool. Then you come to a point where the knower is subsumed into the medium itself. And so the map begins to exist separately from the person who knows the area and is looked at in and of itself as a kind of complete guide by the would-be doer. And this is how maps existed for most, I think, of human history, and certainly when maps began to be mechanically reproduced, the distance from the knower, the human knower, grew, and also you were able to, of course, take that knowledge embedded in the map, in the medium, and spread it very, very widely throughout the world. So the map subsumes the knower. The map becomes an instance of media as knowledge or media as information. Well, more recently, we've seen a very interesting change to the map. The map has started speaking. The map has started to tell us when to turn left, what exit to take, where to go. The map, in other words, having subsumed the knower a long time ago, has began to subsume the doer. And the human being who's going from point A to point B becomes kind of the actuator of the map's instructions. Not really a doer at all. The doing is being done by the medium itself. And ultimately, on the horizon, if you believe companies like Google, the map will reach its ultimate stage of being completely the doer. The map becomes the vehicle. This is Google's latest iteration of its self-driving car. Its goal is to remove the steering wheel, remove the accelerator and the brake pedal. So the map embedded in this robot will take you from point A to point B without you having to do anything or know anything. And this, it strikes me, might be seen as the ultimate end of media, where media takes over the doing aspect that we used to think of as something that we would hold and we would be responsible for. And so at this point, media takes command of us and does things on our behalf. All around us today, we're seeing examples of that playing out, of media taking command through computer automation, software automation. But in this kind of change, this new era of automation became really clear, I think, during just a few months in 2010 and 2011. And that was the time that first we had the unveiling of the fact that Google had built a self-driving car that did a very, very good job of driving in some circumstances, certainly on freeways, on highways. And this was something that, up until that moment, if you read people who prognosticated or studied automation, they often pointed to driving a car as something that a computer or a robot would probably not be able to take over because it requires kind of tacit skills. We don't know how we do it ourselves. It comes through our own experience, through our learning. If somebody told you to write down instructions for how to drive around town or make a left turn, you'd have a real hard time doing it because it's just something you do through your senses and through your motor skills and so forth. So this seemed a radical breakthrough, and was a radical breakthrough, in the ability of computers and robots to navigate the world of things, the world of physical things, in a way that no one had anticipated even shortly before. And then in 2011 came the IBM Watson software program's defeat of the biggest Jeopardy champions of all time, basically slaughtered them, in fact. And that showed us that not only were robots and computers able to navigate the world of physical things, but they were increasingly able to navigate the world of ideas, the world of thoughts, the world of words. And this, even though these two events kind of strikingly brought this forward, they were the result of many advances over many long period of time in all sorts of things, from artificial intelligence and machine learning to sensors, to networking, to robotics, and so forth. All of these things are coming together now in a way that allows computers to do many, many more things than were ever possible before. And in fact, I think it's useful to look at all of the things that we used to think of being our own purview, the things that we would do, and how deeply computers are coming to be able to take over some of those tasks. Not all of them, but some of them. And I was trying to think of a way to express this, and I think you have to start by thinking about, well, what are the modes of doing that people engage in? What are the types of things that we are capable of doing, whether it's at work or in our personal lives or so forth? And I think one way to do that is, one way to map these things is in four general areas, four general categories. Category of action, which incorporates all of our motor skills, things like driving and so forth. The area of analysis, which encompasses our analytical skills, our judgment-making skills, our ability to interpret symbols and ideas and so forth. Our artistic skills that enables us to create new things, new forms, new objects, and so forth. And finally, our skills of persuasion, our interpersonal skills, our communication skills that allow us to influence other people around us. In each of these areas, we're seeing dramatic gains by software and by computers and by robots. In the world of action, for instance, there's not only the various self-driving cars that are around, you can barely make this out, but this is a photograph of a robotic lettuce picker. And it was also believed, along with this sense that robots wouldn't be able to drive cars, there was also a strong belief that they wouldn't be able to pick delicate crops, delicate vegetables and fruits, because they didn't have the dexterity, and also because they couldn't tell the difference between what was edible and what was just a weed. Well, what we've seen recently is these huge robotic tractors that actually take over the work of the people who used to be in the fields picking lettuce. In the area of analysis, we also see, alongside Watson's playing of Jeopardy, all sorts of areas where computers are beginning to take on subtle tasks that human beings used to do. In one of those areas, this is an image of a mammogram image. Computers are doing quite a good job of interpreting medical diagnostic images. So you feed in a digital image, the computer, based on the data fed into it, will highlight different areas on the image that it thinks warrants attention by the doctor. And you can imagine how, as this capability grows, the doctor will have less and less to do, the radiologist, as the computer becomes better and better at interpreting medical images. And you can see this in many other places in the legal field. Language processing computers are now able to take over the discovery of evidence. Computers can read through documents much faster than human beings, and they're actually pretty good not only at finding keywords, but at interpreting language to the point where they can understand relationships between people. They can even understand people's emotions as they express them through language. So they've taken over many, many jobs that used to be held by junior lawyers and paralegals and so forth. Even in the creative world, the world of the arts, we're seeing computers begin to intrude on the work of artists and artisans. This picture is a screenshot from a program called Flux that came out of Google's X Lab, the secret R&D lab where it does its moonshots, as it says. And Google's goal for Flux was actually to create a program that could take over what architects do and actually design buildings and then ultimately design entire cities. A person would plug in, or a politician or whatever, would plug in parameters of what it wanted to achieve with the building, and the software would punch out the plans and give you essentially what an architect used to do. And finally, in the area of persuasion, in the area of interpersonal skills, here too we're seeing computers begin to take over work. If you have Fitbit, for instance, you can get all sorts of little words of encouragement and even nice little badges when you walk, 10,000 steps in a day. There's all sorts of these programs, whether in the area of healthcare, in the area of exercise, where the computer begins to become your kind of doctor or your personal trainer, something to inspire you. And I think that's also true of the various recommendation engines operated by companies like Amazon that recommend what book you should read next, or Netflix recommending what movie you should watch next, and so forth. So in all of these areas of human activity, we see the medium of software moving into a role of doer, the role of actor. And that doesn't mean that all of these jobs in these fields, or all of these jobs incorporating these activities, are going to be taken over by computers. I think a lot of the hype or a lot of the panic today about the massive loss of jobs is probably overdone. I think there are plenty of jobs that are at risk, but I think in many of these areas, it's not going to be that the computer takes over, but what will happen is the computer will change the way the work gets done, will change the role of the person, whether it's a professional at work or you or I going about our business in our personal lives. And what we know about automation from the many studies that have been done about it is that, in fact, it does change the way people behave, the way they act, often in profound ways, if also often in subtle ways. And the people who study this have come up with this term, which I think is a very important one, called the substitution myth. And what they mean by that is when people think about automation, particularly when the designers and programmers who put together these systems think about automation, they think of the computer as substituting directly for some task or some process or some operation that a human being used to do. And they assume that nothing else changes. You can just bring in a computer to do something, and everything else will stay the same. People will continue to behave and act as they always have done. And it turns out that that's not true at all. That once you introduce automation into a task, into an area of work, into an area of effort, it tends to change everything about it, from the way people behave to the roles they play, to the way they think and the way they perceive things. And so here, too, I think we see a good reason to think of automation as a form of media, because we know that when you introduce media into an area, into a person's lives, it does tend to change their behavior, their thinking, their perceptions. And in both cases, these changes often come in ways that were never expected by society, never expected by the people who were creating the systems. And a psychologist at George Mason University named Raja Parasuraman, one of the leading experts on automation, unfortunately he passed away a couple of months ago, but he succinctly expressed what's meant by the substitution myth. He said, automation does not simply supplant human activity, but rather changes it, often in ways unintended and unanticipated by the designers. When you look around at what happens when you introduce automation into a job, you see all sorts of examples of these kind of unexpected changes. And the scholars of automation have come up with terms to express some of these things, and some of these things are quite dangerous. One of them is what's called automation complacency, which means as soon as a computer takes over some aspect of the job, the person involved in the job tunes out. We have enormous trust in machinery, and particularly in computers. So if you say a computer's going to handle this, what happens is we begin to assume that the computer will handle it perfectly. We stop paying attention to that element of the task. We've all experienced this in various ways. If you've ever been typing out something on your phone or on your computer, writing a text or an email or a report, and your autocorrect system corrects one of your typographical errors by switching the word you intended to write with some other word, and then you send that out to somebody and causes you a moment of embarrassment. That's an example of automation complacency. You've placed your trust in the computer to do this perfectly. The computer screws up, and you're not paying attention, so you go ahead and send out the mistake. Well, that's a fairly trivial example. There are very non-trivial examples of automation complacency as well. There's a famous example that happened in 1995, involved a cruise ship named the Royal Majesty. It was on the last leg of a cruise in the Northeast, going from, on this last leg, it was going from, I think, Bermuda to Boston, or the Bahamas, Bermuda to Boston. And it had state-of-the-art automated navigation system. It was receiving signals from GPS satellites. The captain would just plug in where he wanted the ship to arrive, in Boston in this case, and the automated navigation system took over and handled actually setting the ship's course. Well, very early in this voyage, the antenna to the GPS system, the GPS receiver, came undone without anybody noticing. And so the ship began to drift off course. It kept giving the expected coordinates. It kept suggesting on the screen that it was on course, but in fact it was going off course further and further and further in ways that really the seamen on board, the crew on board, should have noticed. In fact, at one point there was a mate whose job it was to watch for a locational buoy that the ship was supposed to pass, and then report back to the bridge if he didn't see it. Well, they were sailing on, and they went past the point where he was supposed to see the buoy. He didn't see it, but he thought, gee, you know, the computer knows what it's doing. I must have just missed it. And so he didn't bother to call the bridge and tell them that he didn't see the buoy. Well, hours and hours later, the ship, as this picture shows, ran aground on a sandbar off of Nantucket Island. Unfortunately, no one was killed or seriously injured, but it was multi-millions of dollars of damage and so forth. And it really emphasizes how easily even very, very skilled professionals become incredibly complacent when they think a computer is handling something. We also see this in aviation. Unfortunately, in these cases, there are lots of casualties when these kind of events take place. Back, if you remember, in 2009, there was the horrific crash of the Air France jet going from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, flying over the Atlantic, and it basically disappeared. Took a couple of years to bring the plane up, and when investigators reviewed the black boxes, what they found is that the plane had gone into bad weather. Its external airspeed sensors had iced over, and what happened then, of course, is that there was no data on airspeed to be fed into the autopilot system. Without that data, the autopilot system shut down, and suddenly the pilots had to take over. Out of the blue, they had been on autopilot for a couple of hours. Suddenly, they had to take command in the midst of this storm that they were going through, and the pilot in command at the time did exactly the wrong thing. He pulled back on the yoke, on the stick rather, which lifted the plane and began to lose airspeed. All of these alarms started going off in the cockpit saying, you've got to speed up, you're going to go into a stall. But he kept pulling back, kept losing airspeed. And eventually the plane did go into a stall and plummeted into the ocean and killed 200 some odd people. So another example, and this is not the only example from the aviation industry of automation complacency. In fact, the FAA has begun telling airlines that they should get pilots to take over controls more often during the course of a flight so as not to fall victim to complacency. Another effect of automation is what's called automation bias. And this is simply our tendency to take whatever a computer tells us as gospel, to believe what it tells us. And if you've ever gone off course while following GPS instructions because you believe what the computer tells you rather than looking around and seeing, boy, this is a really stupid thing to do, you've experienced automation bias. Here, too, though, there are situations where it causes very big problems. There was an episode at a children's hospital in San Francisco in 2013. The hospital, as many hospitals, had introduced automated systems for record keeping, for prescription drug orders, for packaging prescription drugs, and so forth. And a child came in to the hospital and needed an antibiotic. He was quite sick. And the admitting doctor opened up the automated information system, put in instructions to give the child a dose of 160 milligrams of an antibiotic, 160 milligrams being the size of a single tablet. She was, as many doctors in those situations are, she was very busy. This is a screen that she had to enter stuff in that had all sorts of information on it. And what she didn't notice is that the computer system defaulted not to 160 milligrams, but to 160 milligrams per kilogram of patient weight. And she didn't see that, in that instead of being one tablet, that meant the prescription was for 38.5 tablets. This went to the pharmacist. The pharmacist reviewed it, saw that the computer was saying that, this child should get 38.5 antibiotic tablets at once, signed off on it, went off to the robotic machine that put each tablet into a little Ziploc bag, put them all together, went down to the nurse, and the nurse methodically, following the instructions that came through her computer, methodically gave the child 38.5 antibiotic tablets. Fortunately, the boy lived, but he was, as you can imagine, extremely ill. And again, here we see the way that even in very sophisticated arenas where you're dealing with analytical skills and judgment-making skills, people can place so much trust in the computer that they become very much biased and start doing extraordinarily, in retrospect, extraordinarily stupid things. But I think automation bias also influences us in many more ways in our day-to-day lives. So if you think about people's reliance on the Google search engine to find information, find knowledge, it's almost become routine now that if you want to find anything, you Google it. And yet when you think about it, Google has a particular algorithm, particular set of instructions that it uses to find relevant information and to rank relevant information. It tends to be mainly about popularity, as expressed through lots of links coming into a site, for instance, recency, so it values newer postings of information online than older postings, and more it's about personalization, about figuring out what you've done in the past and then gearing its results to that. And there are all sorts of different ways you can search for information other than those things, other than the things Google looks for. You can actually search for information that gives you a broad set of points of view. You can search for information that counteracts your past behavior. You can search for information based on quality rather than recency. And yet I think we're so biased to think that what the computer presents us must be right that we lose sight of the fact that there are all sorts of alternative ways that might be more useful in certain situations. And that's certainly not to denigrate the power of the Google search engine for many types of searches. But we tend to take on faith that Google is presenting us with the best information and lose sight of the fact that there are many other ways we might go about searching for that stuff. I think when you put all of this together, you begin to see what researchers into automation call the automation paradox. And what they mean by that is that often the effects of automation are exactly the opposite of what the designers of the automated system wanted. So often you automate certain activities because you want to reduce the likelihood of human error, and then you find that actually the automation increases the likelihood of human error. Or you want to use automation to increase the quality of the work being done, and you find ultimately that it has a negative effect on the quality. And I think the best way to understand how this works and why we're seeing the automation paradox is by thinking of the Yerkes-Dodson law. Some of you are probably familiar with this. A guy named Robert Yerkes and his student, John Dodson, I think, back 100 years ago or so, were doing an experiment on mice. They wanted to find out how mice, and by extension other animals, how they learn, how they master new situations, overcome challenges, and so forth. And so what they did is they put mice, one at a time, into this box, and at the end of the box were two passageways to get out of the box. One was painted black and one was painted white. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to teach the mice, to go through the white passage. So that was the learning, that was the expertise they wanted to build in the mice. And so they put some kind of electric thing that gave mice shocks if they tried to go in the black passageway. And what they assumed was that as the shock gets stronger, the mice will learn faster. And so the higher the shock, the more quickly the mouse will learn to go down the white passage. But what they found was something very different, that actually a light shock didn't produce much learning. It took a long time for mice to learn that they should go down the white passage. But also a heavy shock produced the same thing. mice had trouble learning when they got the heavy shock, just as they had trouble learning when they got the light shock. And it was really a moderate shock that produced the best learning. And so they expressed this thing, what's come to be known as the Yerkes-Dodson law, through a bell curve. And this is the bell curve. Hopefully you can see it. The vertical axis is the performance of a task, going from weak up to strong. And then the horizontal axis is what they called arousal. You can also think of it as stimulation, going from, on the left side, low arousal to high. And as you can see, that when you don't have much stimulation, whether it's a shock to a mouse or other forms of stimulation, you perform poorly. Then as you get more arousal or more stimulation, your performance goes up, you reach a peak, and then after that, when the shock or whatever gets stronger, your performance falls back down. And since then, it's become pretty clear that the Yerkes-Dodson law is a good way to explain learning in general. So it's not just about shocked mice, it's about human beings too. If we are underloaded with information, underloaded with stress, underloaded with stimulation, we tune out. We fall victim to this kind of complacency, and our performance goes way down because we're not paying attention. We're losing situational awareness. You start to ratchet up the information coming to us or the challenges coming to us, the work we have to do. Our performance goes up sharply. But then at some point, if you have too much stimulation, information overload, too much stress, too much arousal, people become paralyzed by anxiety, and their performance goes down. And what happens with automation all too often is that in most cases, it puts people into the situation of underload, low stimulation. Software programmers, engineers are very good at figuring out where people face challenges, where people face hard work, and then relieving those challenges and relieving that hard work. In fact, that's essentially the goal of a lot of software programmers. Where do people face big challenges, and how can we relieve them of those challenges? And what happens then is we begin to tune out, we become complacent, we lose interest in the work, and our performance goes down. And then, when suddenly something goes wrong with the technology, when the autopilot system goes off or any other thing goes off, suddenly we leap all the way over to the overload part, the stressed out part, because not only do we have to reorient ourselves after losing awareness, but we usually have to deal with a computer too, entering data, checking screens, and so forth. And so we've created this kind of design philosophy of automation that essentially guarantees that people are never in the optimal performance area. They go from underload to overload, but never kind of hit that peak of learning and engagement. And again, you've probably gone through this if you've used GPS in your car or Google Maps in your car to get around, and you're going along fine, you become complacent, you're not paying attention, you're just following, 500 yards, take an exit, go left, whatever, and suddenly you end up lost, either because the software is wrong or because you don't take the right turn or whatever, and suddenly you have to figure out where you are, orient yourself, and probably also grab your phone and fiddle with your phone while driving. And so this is an example of going from underload to overload very, very quickly. There's a deeper problem here, I think, in that this goes beyond, the problems with automation often go beyond performance to the actual way we learn, the actual way we master skills. And this all comes out of another famous psychological discovery, which is referred to as the generation effect. And you may well be aware of this as well. And it was first noted in a study in the 1970s of the way kids learn vocabulary. And the researchers got two groups of students, and one group studied these sets of antonyms, sets of opposites, using flashcards that looked like the top thing here. Both of the words were printed out, hot, cold. And then the other set of students got flashcards that looked like the bottom one here. You had the full word hot, but just in the first letter of the other antonym. They had the students go off and study this set of opposites, set of antonyms, come back, take a test, and it turned out the people who used the flashcards, the bottom kind of flashcards with only the first letter of the second word, performed much, much more highly on the test than the other kids. And what they realized is it's just a matter, and when you think about it, this is really no big surprise, that just having to work a little bit harder, focus a little more as you're forced to do in filling in the word cold in this example, that creates much better learning, heightens memory, heightens expertise, heightens know-how. And again, this has been found to be true over and over again. It's kind of a fundamental finding, particularly in educational psychology. If you get students to work a little bit harder to generate information rather than just reading it or watching a YouTube video or whatever, you get much greater learning. And what happens too often with automation, because it reduces our engagement with our work and reduces the challenge that we face, is that, in fact, it turns the generation effect into what I call a degeneration effect. You're never challenged to learn. You're never challenged to create your own expertise. And as a result, you don't learn, and you don't kind of go up the ladder of knowledge and know-how. So this provides, I think, a way to think about what happens when, at least when we do it unwisely, as I think too often we do, when media takes command in the form of automation and we become reliant on computers to do things we used to do ourselves, particularly hard things, challenging things. And what we've seen in the history of automation, in the history of mechanization before it, is this sense that by freeing us of work, automation or mechanization would be a means of liberation, even a way to get to some utopian state. And you see this over and over again. This is, I think, what McLuhan was expressing in that quote I pulled from, as well as in other sections of Understanding Media and elsewhere where he talks about automation. And this dates back certainly to Karl Marx in 1846, wrote about machinery having the wonderful power of shortening and fructifying human labor. And ultimately, he projected that when new technology, production technology was deployed in a communist society, that people like himself would be free to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind. Marx at least understood that before technology could create this utopia, there would have to be massive economic and political changes. But as you go forward through the years, that kind of political and economic sense begins to fade away, and people put their faith in technology, particularly production technology, mechanization, and automation, to, in and of itself, by relieving us of the need to work, create this utopia, create this environment of liberation. So in 1891, Oscar Wilde writes an article about how machinery was going to free us from what he termed free us from all unintellectual labor, all monotonous, dull labor. And so ultimately, he went on, while humanity will be amusing itself or enjoying cultivated leisure or making beautiful things or reading beautiful things or simply contemplating the world with admiration and delight, machinery will be doing all the necessary and unpleasant work. And then you have John Maynard Keynes, the economist, in 1930 at the onset of the Great Depression, writing an article about how machinery and other technologies would, in about 100 years, allow us to reach our destination of economic bliss. And then he said, the only work we'd have to do at that point is learn how to enjoy rather than to strive. And then we have McLuhan, as I started with, arguing in 1964 that the patterns of automation are self-employment and artistic autonomy. What it actually looks like is that the patterns of automation are underemployment and meth addiction, but that's how he saw it. And finally, I'll end with just last year, Mark Andreessen, the guy who was founder of Netscape and is now one of the top venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, in a series of tweets, wrote about this utopia that the computer was going to bring and that automation was going to bring. And he wrote, "We will be whoever we want to be. The main fields of human endeavor will be culture, arts, sciences, creativity, philosophy, experimentation, exploration, adventure. Rather than nothing to do, we would have everything to do. Curiosity, artistic and scientific creativity, new forms of status seeking. Imagine 6 or 10 billion people doing nothing but arts and sciences, culture, and exploring and learning. What a world that would be. Flower power is still alive in San Francisco, at least as a mask for other kinds of power. I think the reality of automation, the reality of what happens when media takes control, becomes the doer as well as the knower, is one of dependency. For all the reasons, all the dynamics I've gone through, what we see is when computers begin to take over things, we do become quickly dependent on them, reliant on them. That means we're not exercising our skills in a way that leads to learning and talent development. So we begin to go through the process of de-skilling, same kind of process we saw in lots of factory workers during the Industrial Revolution. And as you become de-skilled, then you become more dependent on the machine to do the work for you, and that leads to another round of de-skilling. And I think the fact that automation exists as software that is invisible to us, a kind of a form of invisible media in this black box that we simply trust, the way we trust the Google search results, this isn't only a cycle of dependency and de-skilling, it also opens us up to manipulation. Because when we become dependent on this invisible program that's determining often, how we get from point A to point B, or what information we look at, or what book we read next, or who we date next, or whatever, we also become dependent on what's going on in that black box, what the programmers have chosen, and that means that we can be manipulated without even knowing that we're manipulated, because unlike the machinery of the past, we can't see what's going on inside the box. So rather than liberating us, I think this stage of automation will tend to just give much more power, economic and cultural, to the programmers. It will be the programming, in media terms, that becomes the generator of cultural power and economic power. And I think we see this already in many places in the economy, in the culture as well. If you control the programming, if you control the computers and the data centers, you have enormous amounts of power thanks to this cycle of dependency that we're setting off. So I think rather than seeing automation as a kind of break, this sharp break, as McLuhan thought, from the world of mechanization, from the industrial era, I think in many ways it's a continuation of it. I titled my book that came out last year about automation, The Glass Cage, and when I titled it that, I wasn't really thinking about Max Weber's famous image of the iron cage of industrial capitalism, but the more I think about it, the more I see a kind of progression between those two. So back 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, Weber wrote about how the Protestant work ethic, which made work a means to a greater end, by working rather than being idle, you were kind of doing the Lord's work, the Lord's bidding, and ultimately that improved your odds for going to heaven, but it was also a means of infusing work and labor with a kind of spiritual component. But the entry of machinery in the capitalist system actually drained that kind of transcendental spiritual side out of the work, and simply labor became labor, not for transcending our daily lives, not for something higher, but simply to let us be better consumers, essentially, to make money so we could buy things. And what I think we're seeing with automation is a very similar kind of shift from our expectation about it to what actually happens. So we have this expectation that, if we only have less to do, if our computers can do all this stuff for us, that will liberate us and free us to pursue higher types of goals, to be artists and creative types and so forth. And what we're seeing is the reality makes us dependent. Instead of, it kind of drains that side of our lives rather than amplifying it, and again makes us into better consumers ultimately. And we see in some ways the most eloquent expressions of these ideas through popular culture. Back in the 1930s, we had Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times kind of working out on screen the idea of being trapped in a glass cage, but actually, as he's smiling there as he works the lever, being happy in that materialist world, that consumerist world. And Wall-E, I think, provides us with a new kind of counterpart to the movie Modern Times, Pixar's Wall-E, where people have, in the future, human beings become trapped in this kind of glass cage of constant online stimulation, don't ever look beyond the computer. So let me end by going back to the initial slide that I put up, which had this kind of enigmatic picture of a psychologist putting a mouse into a maze to do some experiment, and I cut off part of the picture, and this is the whole picture. It's actually not a psychologist putting a mouse into a maze. It's Claude Shannon, who was essentially the father of information science, creator of much of our understanding of information as this kind of material thing that can be manipulated. And what he's putting into the maze is actually a robot in the shape of a mouse, a robotic mouse, in order to test whether a robotic mouse could be programmed to find its way out of a maze, which indeed it can do. And when I first saw this picture, which was quite a long time ago, somewhere online, I thought it was kind of amusing. And for a while, I actually used it as the kind of backdrop for my computer screen. And then it started to seem creepier and creepier to me and darker. And I think ultimately that now, when I look at it, this picture of an information scientist putting a robotic mouse into a maze, I think it may be the perfect visual metaphor for our time. So thank you. Thanks. There's a portable one here.
Congratulations on a great presentation. Jonathan Zittrain from Harvard calls for a concept which is collective efficiency as a result of adding collective experience plus collective intelligence, which sounds pretty good for the human being. But what would be the balance between this concept and the human being not being lazy? Because only the human being makes mistakes. So it seems that the media and the technology may become the enemy, but it is ourselves that are the enemies, maybe. And why not taking advantage of this media and technology and pedagogy to make for a system for the human being trying to defeat our tendencies and mistakes?
Yeah. I think one of maybe the major kind of thing I learned from doing this research into automation is that it doesn't have to be the way that I've laid out. The way that we do automation today, people who study this refer to it as technology-centered automation, which means that the engineers and the programmers, they start by saying, what can computers do? And then they say, anything a computer can do, the computer should do it. And then what's left over, the human being should do, until we can figure out how to automate that. And that basically guarantees that the person is left in a passive role, watching screens, entering data. And then when something goes wrong because the person, as I described, is out of the loop and not paying attention, the person screws up. And the lesson that the programmers and the engineers get is, boy, we can't trust people, so let's figure out how to automate even more stuff so we can get the person out of the loop. There is an alternative, and that's often called human-centered automation, where you begin by saying, you know, what can people do that's valuable? And it turns out we still can do lots of things computers can't do. Creative thinking, conceptual thinking, critical thinking, all those type of things. And then design the system around those so we encourage the growth of human expertise, while also getting the very, very important benefits you can get from working with a computer, all the types of information that a computer can bring to bear. So I do think in many ways this is a design issue that human beings are in control of, and I don't think it's the destiny of automation to play out in this way. I think this is the road that we're on for economic reasons, for reasons of kind of the thinking of the technologists who are creating the system. But I do think there are ways to approach automation in computerization that actually do encourage the growth of human expertise and human know-how and human creativity. We're just not taking those paths today.
Thank you very much for interesting presentation. My question is, machines then, computers, have been designed to substitute humans' function, activities, and actually they are designed to substitute humans. And what if they will succeed? What happens then? And when it happens? When will it happen? And so what will be the, will you see that it will be a new civilization, probably? Have you any things about that?
So you're asking what happens when they substitute completely?
Yes, right. And final point on this way.
Yeah. I personally don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I think a lot of the speculation about computers being able to take over kind of all human work and all human jobs, which would require computers to start to be able to program themselves, to kind of display the kind of common sense and fluid intelligence that we demonstrate because we're living creatures who experience things in the world and then can take that experience and apply it very flexibly to other things. I don't see any sign that computers are gaining that type of ability. That doesn't mean I can rule it out. Who knows what's going to happen? But I think when you look at the arguments that a lot of people make about, you know, whether it's the singularity, where computers leap ahead of us and, you know, make us their subjects or whatever, or it's the kind of dystopian view of all human work going away because computers can do it better than we can, I think all of those predictions require all sorts of leaps of faith about how we go from where we are, and we've made great advances in artificial intelligence, but to the place where computers do have a kind of self-awareness, kind of consciousness that allows them to do their own programming. We don't even know where our own consciousness comes from. So it's not like computer programmers have a template they can follow. They're simply saying, well, computers are getting so much faster and faster and faster that inevitably they'll be able to take over everything. I would question that ever happening. So I think the real challenge, I think it would be useful to not stop thinking about it in those terms, because it makes kind of everything seem trivial, that, oh, we're not going to have to worry about it in a few years because computers are going to do everything. I believe that, you know, we and computers are going to be working together indefinitely, and we should do it in the wisest possible way, and not either fall victim to utopianism or dystopianism in thinking about the future.
Good evening, Nick. Thanks for taking the time to address us. Just a real quick question, and my apologies if it's worded too much in a McLuhan-esque idiom, but what do you think is the new ground that is essentially making robots, automation, AI, and pretty much the substance of your talk visible?
Can you say that again?
Like, in McLuhan's terms, like, what is the new environment, or the ground, or the, what would we consider, like, the technological weather that is making these things that you talk about, like automation, robots, AI, visible as figures?
I fear that you've gone beyond the depth of my understanding of McLuhan. So I don't understand exactly what you mean by making visible.
Okay, what's the context that has made the text visible?
What he's referring to, Nick, is the figure ground interrelationship that McLuhan talks about.
I mean, I don't think this is, as I said, ever since the late 40s and early 50s, we've been aware of this, and both fearing it and thinking that it's going to deliver us from, deliver us from labor and return us to a new Eden. So I don't think it's something that's happened. I see this more as a cyclical thing, where, after World War II, when there were some breakthroughs in the electronic control that allowed us to create like anti-aircraft guns, which were very visible, and suddenly that crystallized, and at the same time that mainframe computers began to be built, it crystallized in the public this sense that we could create machines that could do very, very subtle and very sophisticated work, and it was very visible all around us, and that created this kind of sense that this was happening so quickly that it would, that there would be no limit to it. And that was amplified in the late 50s by the origin of research into artificial intelligence and all these promises that were made in the late 50s, early 60s that within a few years we'll be able to figure out the algorithms behind everything that our brain can do, and then it'll be a simple matter to program it. And then what happened is we entered what's called an AI winter, where it turned out that things were actually a lot harder than we expected, and that our brains didn't work the way the AI researchers did. And so the kind of technological progress tailed off, and with it, the fears and the hopes about automation kind of disappeared or kind of went silent for a while. And then recently, thanks to things like the Google car that kind of viscerally make this clear to us, suddenly we see an upswing in our concern again.
I apologize for the philosophical question here, but I just want to know what you think. Do you think this desire towards automation is a naturally human characteristic, or is it something that is kind of socially instilled in us? And I'm asking, as somebody that believes that the desire to kind of master language and use language is in many ways kind of an automation, looking back at something like a public speech or even religion as kind of serving these purposes that make being human a touch easier.
I'm not sure I got the point about the public speaking as an example of what?
Kind of telling us how to think, helping us think, making sense of our lives. Do you think these kinds of tools, are we inclined towards them, to them as human beings, or is it something that just kind of, that inclination socially instilled in us?
I think we're very much inclined to them as human beings. And that's not to reduce the importance of, economic factors and political factors and power factors in it, but I think we're very much drawn to anything that promises to ease our way through life and to give us greater convenience. And so if a computer can do something for us, we don't tend to think about whether we'd actually feel more satisfied if we did it ourselves or if we'd gain greater skill if we did it ourselves. We say, great, do it, and then I'll have more time for something else. And it turns out, and I think this is pretty clear from the psychological studies, that actually people are happiest when they're facing hard challenges and overcoming them. And yet we have this instinct that says, oh, if a computer can do this instead of forcing me to struggle with it, I'll be better off. And yet we end up not better off. We actually end up feeling less satisfied and more anxious or whatever, and more dependent. So I do think that there's something deep within us that is probably not, is probably something that we should resist, that kind of inclines us to to value convenience more highly than we should value it. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking, I mean, just a quick comment first that you could actually go back to the Ten Commandments for an understanding of this. And what's often missed about the commandment to observe the Sabbath is that it says 6 days you shall labor. So it actually commands you to work 6 days as well as observe the Sabbath on the seventh. But I was thinking, I mean, especially Andrew's question about what made this visible made me think of James Benneger's book, The Control Revolution, you know, where he argues that it was the Industrial Revolution introduced this enormous complexity of technology, which then required a second kind of technological revolution to control the first one. And, you know, he goes through all different kinds of mechanisms of control. And obviously automation is there to control machines that are so complex that human beings are challenged, if not completely unable to control them. So in your opinion, would the solution be to try to scale back the complexity of technology generally, or is it simply to just create a new kind of technological fix? I almost think of the right stuff where, you know, the pilots were, the test pilots like Chuck Yeager were in complete control of what they were doing, and then the Mercury astronauts were basically, and they had to argue to put a window in so they wouldn't appear to be complete, just passive baggage on this. So, I mean, is it just to put a fix in a kind of busy work to give us something to do while the automation still is the only thing capable of dealing with the complexity of our technological system? Yeah,
I mean, I think both of those points are very good ones, and I think you're right that Benneger's conception that technology forces some things out of control, and so we need new technology to come in to control it, does make sense. He has a great example of in the late 19th century when so much information suddenly was being collected because we suddenly had, you know, complex commerce throughout the nation and stuff, and growing population, that the Census Bureau couldn't tabulate. It took it more than 10 years to tabulate the census, so a new census started before we had the results of the former census, and that led to the development of the punch card tabulator, which became the computer and entered control. And I think it kind of viscerally makes sense that now that so much information has been digitized and we can collect massive, far, far more, that we need more automation to control that or to put it to productive use. So that makes a lot of sense. I think, you know, I think the response is going to be a mix of things. In some ways, it's going to be fabricating a sense of work and a sense of engagement. For instance, Boeing, there's a very big difference between the philosophy of Boeing and Airbus in planes. Airbus wants to get rid of the pilot, at least that's what it used to say, and it replaced the big yoke with a little joystick next to the pilot. And Boeing went in a different direction. There's no reason for this big yoke to be in front of the pilot because all it's doing is sending electronic signals to the various machines in the plane. It's not actually physically moving things the way it used to do. But not only did Boeing keep the yoke, but it simulates feedback. So it feels to the pilot like he's, you know, struggling against the air or whatever, even though it's completely simulated. But that still keeps the pilot, I think, more engaged with the work than the Airbus does. And so I think that, you know, one thing that we can do in some circumstances is actually program the computer to give that kind of feedback, even if it's artificial. And it's not just simulation for simulation's sake. It's that when the pilot actually has to do something, that simulation can make it more likely that the pilot will do the right thing. So I also think that video games provide a good example of software that encourages skill building. the skill you might get is just how to play video games better, but everything we know about learning and skill building is very much encapsulated in video games that require you to go through challenges over and over again until you master them. Then you get another challenge that's a little harder, and you go through that, and you get rewarded, and so on. And I would hope in the future that some of that model of thinking about software, which turns out to be not only builds your skills, but makes you feel satisfied, which is why a lot of people play video games, could be transferred over to productive kinds of software. So instead of pursuing the goal of frictionlessness, as software programmers tend to do, where does the human being feel any friction, and let's get rid of that, which creates this kind of Wall-E world, I think. You could think about it, how do we actually introduce some friction and force the human being to work a little bit? I understand that I can be accused of naivete because often, these decisions are made for economic reasons, that you want highest possible productivity as quickly as possible. So get the human being out of the picture, or make sure that the human being doesn't have to struggle. But still, I think in the long run, we have to think about, software in terms of what we know about human learning and human satisfaction and human fulfillment even, because if we are going to be relying on these things so much for so much of our lives, we should design them in a way that doesn't simply say we're useless, but actually appreciates us, if that makes sense.
This doesn't have to do with automation per se, but it does, to me, think about the glass cage. And what are your thoughts about Google Glasses?
About Google Glass?
Again, the metaphor for the glass cage.
I'm very kind of relieved that so far it's failed. For a long time, I've been looking for that moment when Silicon Valley kind of pushes things too far and people just say, are you crazy? And maybe we've reached that with Google Glass, because for all the hype and for all the money Google put into it, most people's reaction was that why would I want this thing on my face? And so suddenly this kind of, and it's really for the first time, I think, this kind of disjunction between Silicon Valley's dream for us and what people actually want kind of came to the fore. Now, 5 years from now, I might be completely proven wrong when Google comes out with another version that only costs, $100 instead of $1,500, and everybody is suddenly, going around and getting messages beamed onto their glasses and taking video of everybody else. But I think, so I'm optimistic that so far Google Glass has failed. If that type of thing became a success, then you see the environment of automation kind of incorporate. We become inside it almost all the time, because suddenly the instructions that are coming from the Googles of the world, or the Facebooks of the world, or the Amazons of the world are constantly in our field of view. And overlaid on the natural world or the cultural world or whatever. So if ultimately that type of thing is successful, then I think that would be an even further progression of kind of what I see as this kind of cycle of dependency on the machine and on the programmers of the machine.
Nipping around sort of the exterior of a lot of your talk is an economic argument. At what point do you see the economy in itself as part of, what shall we say, the equation, part of the calculus? At what part does this work as a governor? At what part may it work as a major economic disruptor?
Well, since we don't yet know how much labor will be displaced by computers, I mean, we definitely know a substantial amount because we've already seen some of that happen. It's very, very hard to predict the labor market effects and ultimately the economic effects. I do think that even if the projections of job losses prove to be overblown, as I think they might, I think there's the other dynamic of exactly what jobs are left. We might have enough jobs for a lot of people, but are they going to be full employment, not only full employment as full-time, but full employment as using people's full talents, or are they going to be something less? In there, I think the picture is considerably more scary, so that we see the increasing divide between the haves and the have-nots that we've seen growing for a number of years now. And certainly automation plays to that through the replacement of talented, well-paid workers with capital, with machinery. So I think even if the fears are overblown, I think there are going to be economic stresses that are already beginning to appear and are going to come more and more to the fore. And my own guess will be that what we'll see is ultimately what we'll have to see is a reinvigorated labor movement of some type that begins to take back some of the power for workers and away from the owners of the programs and stuff. But you know, that would require some big changes, big social and cultural changes in the way people think about work, and so even that we won't get there without a lot of stress and a lot of unpleasantness.
For our session, please join me in thanking Nicholas Carr for his stimulating thoughts.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.